There is a version of history that gets told with remarkable consistency across textbooks, documentaries, and political speeches in certain parts of the world. It goes something like this. Africa before European colonization was a continent without infrastructure, without industry, without the systems of governance and economic organization that define modern civilization. Then the Europeans arrived, and particularly the British, and they built railways, ports, telegraph lines, administrative systems, legal frameworks. And when they left behind the foundations of the modern African state. It is a comforting story. A story that allows former colonial powers to frame their presence in Africa as a civilizing mission rather than what it actually was. And if you examine the infrastructure closely, if you look not just at what was built but at the logic that determined where it went and what it connected, the story starts to fall apart in ways that are genuinely disturbing. Welcome to the Industrial Ledger. This is where we examine the systems underneath the systems. The infrastructure that shaped the modern world and the interests that shaped the infrastructure. If you are here for comfortable myths about progress and development, you are in the wrong place. If you are here for the truth about how industrial systems actually work and who they actually serve, you are home. Hit subscribe. Let me give you a number that should immediately make you suspicious of the standard narrative. Between 1870 and 1914, the height of British colonial expansion in Africa, Britain built approximately 10,000 miles of railway across the African continent. 10,000 miles. It sounds impressive. It sounds like development. It sounds like the kind of infrastructure investment that transforms economies and lifts populations out of poverty. And then you look at a map. The railway network that Britain built across Africa has a pattern. A very clear, very consistent, very difficult to ignore pattern. And that pattern tells you everything you need to know about what those railways were actually for. Take the Uganda Railway, completed in 1901. It runs from Mombasa on the Kenyan coast inland to Kampala in the interior of Uganda. Over 600 miles of track. Thousands of workers. Millions of pounds in investment. The official justification at the time was to facilitate trade, to bring the benefits of modern transport to the region, to integrate East Africa into the global economy. It was presented as an act of development, of bringing civilization to a part of the world that supposedly lacked it. Now look at what that railway actually connects. It does not connect Kenyan cities to each other. It does not link population centers in a way that would facilitate internal trade or domestic economic integration. It runs in a straight line from the coast to the interior, passing through regions rich in ivory, rubber, and agricultural land that the British had identified for export crop production. The railway was not built to develop Kenya or Uganda. It was built to move Kenyan and Ugandan resources to the coast as efficiently as possible so they could be loaded onto ships and sent to Britain. This is not unique to the Uganda Railway. The same pattern repeats with almost mechanical consistency across every British colonial territory in Africa. Southern Rhodesia, modern-day Zimbabwe. The railways run from the copper and gold mines in the interior directly to ports in Mozambique and South Africa. Nigeria. The railway connects the tin mines and groundnut-producing regions of the north to the port of Lagos. The Gold Coast, modern Ghana. The railway links cocoa-growing regions to the port at Takoradi for export. Kenya. The railway connects the interior highlands, seized for white settler agriculture, to Mombasa. Every single one of these railway lines follows the same logic. From the resource to the port. From the mine to the ship. From the interior to the coast. They are not networks. They are arteries, designed for one-directional flow. Out. And it was not just the railways. The roads the British built in Africa followed the same pattern. Connecting mines to ports. Plantations to shipping terminals. Administrative centers to resource extraction sites. The port facilities that Britain expanded and modernized across the African coast were not designed to facilitate African trade with the world. They were designed to facilitate the export of African resources to British markets and the import of British manufactured goods back into African colonies. The telegraph lines the British strung across the continent were not built to connect Africans to each other. They were built to allow colonial administrators and mining companies to communicate with London, to coordinate extraction operations, to transmit commodity prices and shipping schedules. The legal systems the British imposed were not designed to protect African property rights or facilitate African entrepreneurship. They were designed to protect British commercial interests, to enforce contracts that favored British firms, and to create a regulatory environment that made resource extraction as cheap and as legally secure as possible. Every piece of infrastructure the British built in Africa, every railway line, every port expansion, every road, every administrative system, was designed with a single purpose: to extract African resources at the lowest possible cost and move them to Britain and British-controlled markets as efficiently as possible. This was not an accident. This was not poor planning. This was not a failure to understand what genuine economic development required. This was a deliberate, systematic, meticulously planned infrastructure strategy designed to serve British industrial and commercial interests. And it worked. It worked extraordinarily well. Between 1900 and 1960, Britain extracted hundreds of millions of pounds worth of copper, gold, diamonds, tin, rubber, cotton, cocoa, palm oil, and timber from its African colonies. The infrastructure they built made that extraction possible at a scale and efficiency that would not have been achievable without it. British factories received a steady supply of raw materials at prices far below what they would have paid on open markets. British shipping companies profited from the transport. British banks financed the operations. British colonial administrators ensured the system ran smoothly. And when the resources left African ports, they generated wealth for British industries, British shareholders, British workers, and the British economy. What they did not do was develop Africa. Here is what extraction infrastructure does not do. It does not create an integrated domestic economy. It does not facilitate trade between regions within a country. It does not support the development of local manufacturing industries. It does not build the kind of economic complexity that allows a nation to move up the value chain from exporting raw materials to producing finished goods. And most critically, it does not create the conditions for self-sustaining economic growth that persists after the colonial power leaves. What it does instead is lock an economy into a very specific structural position. You export raw materials. You import finished goods. You generate revenue for someone else's industrial economy. And you remain permanently dependent on terms of trade that are set by the markets you export to, markets you have no control over and no ability to influence. This is not speculation. This is not ideological critique. This is what actually happened. And the evidence is overwhelming. In 1960, when most British African colonies gained independence, their economies had a remarkably similar structure regardless of which specific resources they were exporting. They had infrastructure designed for extraction and export. They had virtually no domestic manufacturing capacity. They had education systems that trained clerks and administrators, but not engineers or industrial managers. They had legal and financial systems designed to facilitate foreign investment in resource extraction, but not domestic entrepreneurship or industrial development. And they had populations that had been systematically prevented from accumulating capital, acquiring technical skills, or participating in anything other than low-wage labor in mines, plantations, and colonial administration. Take Nigeria as an example. At independence in 1960, Nigeria was one of the largest producers of palm oil, groundnuts, cocoa, and tin in the world. Decades of British infrastructure investment had created highly efficient systems for extracting these resources and shipping them to Britain. The railways worked. The ports were functional. The administrative systems that coordinated production and export were sophisticated and effective. And yet Nigeria had virtually no manufacturing industry. No factories producing finished goods from its own raw materials. No industrial workforce trained in modern production techniques. No domestic market integrated enough to support large-scale manufacturing, even if the factories had existed. The infrastructure that Britain had spent decades building had created an economy that was extraordinarily good at one thing: sending raw materials out, and almost incapable of doing anything else. The same pattern repeated across British Africa. Ghana at independence was the world's largest cocoa exporter. It had excellent infrastructure for moving cocoa from the interior to the coast. It had almost no capacity to process that cocoa into chocolate or any other finished product. Zambia and Zimbabwe had world-class copper and gold mining operations with railways and ports optimized for mineral export. They had virtually no domestic industries that used those minerals as inputs for manufacturing. Kenya had railways connecting its agricultural highlands to the coast for tea and coffee export. It had almost no food processing industry, serving its own domestic population. This was not an accident. This was the intended outcome. Because the last thing Britain wanted was for its African colonies to develop their own manufacturing industries. African factories would have competed with British factories. African manufactured goods would have reduced demand for British imports. African industrial capacity would have meant that the raw materials being extracted from African mines and plantations might stay in Africa to be processed locally rather than being shipped to Britain. The entire logic of colonial infrastructure investment was designed to prevent exactly that outcome. Keep Africa as a supplier of raw materials. Keep it as a market for British manufactured goods. And build infrastructure that reinforces that relationship rather than disrupts it. And here is the thing that makes this story even more important to understand. That infrastructure did not disappear when independence came. The railways are still there. The ports are still there. The roads that connect mines to shipping terminals are still there. And in many cases, they are still serving the same function they were designed to serve a century ago. Because once you have built an economy around extraction and export, changing that structure is extraordinarily difficult. The infrastructure is already in place pointing in one direction. The trade relationships are established. The domestic economy has never developed the complexity or the industrial base to do anything else. And the international financial institutions, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the aid agencies, all of them spent decades after independence encouraging African countries to keep doing exactly what they had been doing under colonialism. Export raw materials. Import finished goods. Take loans to finance the trade deficit. And service that debt by exporting even more raw materials. This is what economists call path dependency. The choices made in the past, the infrastructure built in the past, the economic structures established in the past, constrain what is possible in the present. And the path that British colonial infrastructure set African economies on in the late 19th and early 20th centuries is a path that many of them are still trying to escape. There are African countries today, in 2026, that are still exporting the same raw materials they were exporting in 1960. Still using the same railways built by the British to move those materials to the same ports. Still importing manufactured goods rather than producing them domestically. Still generating wealth for economies elsewhere while remaining trapped in the structural position of raw material supplier. That is not underdevelopment in the sense of never having developed. That is maldevelopment, the deliberate construction of an economic structure designed to serve external interests rather than internal ones. And the infrastructure that Britain built in Africa was the foundation of that structure. So when someone tells you that Britain built Africa, that Britain brought development and infrastructure and modernity to a continent that lacked it, ask them a very simple question. Built it for whom? Because the railways that run from mines to ports are not development. They're logistics. The ports that export raw materials and import finished goods are not the foundations of a modern economy. They are the foundations of a permanently dependent one. And the administrative and legal systems that facilitate foreign extraction while suppressing domestic industry are not civilization. They are conquest. The British did not build Africa. They built a machine. A highly efficient, ruthlessly optimized, carefully engineered machine for moving African wealth to Britain. And they left that machine behind when they left. Still running. Still pointing in the same direction. Still doing what it was always designed to do. So if Britain did not build Africa, then who did? The answer is so obvious that it is almost offensive that the question needs to be asked at all. Africans built Africa. African labor. African engineers. African skilled workers. African hands laid every mile of those railway tracks. African bodies carried the materials. African expertise solved the problems that British engineers encountered in unfamiliar terrain. And African lives were spent, often literally, in the construction of the infrastructure that Britain then claimed credit for. The Uganda Railway, that 600-mile line from Mombasa to Kampala that is so often held up as an example of British engineering achievement, was built by over 30,000 laborers, the vast majority of them African and Indian, working in conditions that killed thousands. The official death toll is over 2,500. The actual number is almost certainly higher because record-keeping for African and Indian workers was inconsistent at best and deliberately suppressed at worst. Those workers built the railway. They cleared the land. They laid the tracks. They carved the route through mountains and across rivers. The ports were constructed by African dock workers. The roads were built by African labor gangs. often working under systems of forced labor that were slavery in all but name. When you say Britain built Africa, what you are actually saying is that Britain organized African labor, often through coercion and violence, to build infrastructure that served British economic interests. That is not the same thing. That is not even close to the same thing. But there is another answer to the question of who built Africa that goes even deeper than this. Because even before the British arrived, Africa was not the blank slate that colonial mythology requires it to be. African societies had infrastructure. They had trade networks. They had systems of governance and economic organization that were sophisticated, effective, and in many cases more advanced than what existed in Europe at the same time. The trans-Saharan trade routes that moved gold, salt, ivory, and slaves across North Africa for over 1,000 years were not built by Europeans. They were built and maintained by African and Arab traders operating across some of the most difficult terrain on Earth. The city of Timbuktu in the 14th and 15th centuries was one of the wealthiest and most intellectually vibrant cities in the world, a center of learning and commerce with libraries, universities, and trade networks that stretched across the Sahara and down the Niger River. The Kingdom of Congo in Central Africa had a sophisticated administrative system, a monetized economy, and diplomatic relationships with European powers that treated it as an equal until the slave trade and colonialism destroyed it. Great Zimbabwe, built between the 11th and 15th centuries, was a city of stone that housed up to 18,000 people and served as the center of a trading empire that stretched across southern Africa. The level of architectural and engineering sophistication required to build Great Zimbabwe is so high that when European colonizers encountered it in the 19th century, they refused to believe that Africans had built it and spent decades trying to attribute it to Phoenicians or Arabs or anyone other than the people who actually lived there. The infrastructure that Britain built in Africa did not fill a vacuum. It replaced existing systems that had been functioning, in many cases for centuries, before the British arrived. And in replacing those systems, it destroyed the economic and political autonomy that had allowed them to exist in the first place. The railway from the coast to the interior did not bring trade to regions that had never known it. It redirected existing trade away from internal African networks and toward European-controlled ports. The legal systems the British imposed did not bring order to societies that lacked it. They replaced existing legal traditions with frameworks designed to facilitate extraction and suppress resistance. The administrative structures the British built did not create governance where none existed. They dismantled existing political systems and replaced them with colonial bureaucracies answerable to London rather than to the people they governed. This is what colonialism does. It does not develop. It displaces. It takes what exists, breaks it, and rebuilds it in a form that serves the colonizer rather than the colonized. And then it calls that process development and expects gratitude for it. So when we ask who built Africa, the answer depends on what you mean by built. If you mean who constructed the physical infrastructure of railways and ports and roads that exist today, the answer is African labor organized and directed by British capital and British interests. If you mean who created the economic and political systems that allowed African societies to function before colonialism, the answer is Africans, over centuries, building and rebuilding and adapting in response to their own needs and their own circumstances. And if you mean who is responsible for the infrastructure and the systems that will finally allow African economies to break out of the extraction trap that colonialism built, the answer is the same. Africans, building the infrastructure that serves African interests rather than external ones. Developing the industries that process African resources into finished goods for African and global markets. Constructing the trade networks and the regional integration and the domestic economic complexity that genuine development requires. That work is happening, right now, across the continent. African countries are building railways that connect African cities to each other rather than just connecting mines to ports. They are building manufacturing industries that process raw materials domestically rather than exporting them for others to refine. They are building regional trade agreements that facilitate commerce between African nations rather than just between Africa and former colonial powers. They are building universities and technical schools that train the engineers and the industrial managers and the entrepreneurs that a modern economy requires. It is slow. It is difficult. It is happening against the inherited structural constraints of a century of extraction infrastructure. But it is happening. and it is being built by the same people who built everything else in Africa that ever mattered. Africans. The British did not build Africa. They built a system to extract wealth from Africa, while preventing Africa from building itself. That system is still being dismantled. And the infrastructure that replaces it, the infrastructure that actually serves African development rather than external extraction, is being built right now by people who never needed the British to tell them how to build in the first place. If this story changed the way you think about infrastructure, about colonialism, or about who actually builds the world we live in, share it. The Industrial Ledger exists to examine the systems that shaped history and the interests that shaped those systems. Subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. And drop a comment below telling me whether you think the infrastructure legacy of colonialism is something African countries should preserve and repurpose, or tear down and replace entirely. I genuinely want to know what you think.